We're not going back, without massive suffering. And also potentially we're not going forward without massive suffering. Now, these are very ugly choices. The choices are not good. They're not like we have some perfect choice, which only if everyone could get on the same page, we could move forward on. Unfortunately, the choices are all not good. There are various forms of massive change with very uncertain outcomes. That's the situation that we're in. It's not a happy situation to be in. But the question of what to do in the face of, as I say, these sort of irreversible changes, or changes that are irreversible on a human life scale, or even on in terms of the foreseeable future for humans, these are the questions that we keep bumping up against. And what we're very, very good at doing is trying to come up with, technological solutions to these problems. Will they work? That is sort of the question of our century.
My name is Grzegorz Jankowicz, and I am the program director of the Conrad Festival. This is the first episode of a year-long series of talks entitled The Nature of the Future. To be precise, it is the first episode of the second season. Your reactions to season 1 were really great. You've supported me and encouraged me to keep going. So here we go again. I was wondering who I should invite for the beginning. When I learned that Elizabeth Kolbert's book Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future, would be published in Polish, I figured I had to talk to her. And here she is with us. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hi there.
Thank you for accepting the invitation. And let me briefly introduce you to our audience. Elizabeth Kolbert is an American journalist. She studied literature at the Yale University. She is one of the most prominent experts on climate change and environmental issues. She has worked for The New Yorker since 1999. Among her books, there are field notes from a catastrophe, Man, Nature and Climate Change, and The Sixth Extinction, An Unnatural History, among others. Elizabeth, once again, thank you for being with us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I propose controlling nature as the topic of our conversation because I think that this is the main theme of your last work. In my opinion, everything related to the climate crisis should first reach our imagination. This is the only way I know to get individuals and communities to understand and to act. So to stimulate our imagination, I would like to ask you, Elizabeth, to bring some examples from your book Under a White Sky. Examples of bad control. For the beginning, let's talk about controlling nature that caused a lot of problems. Like first thing that comes to my mind, there is Chicago River running in one direction, and one day a group of people come to the conclusion that it would be better for the river and for them to run in the opposite direction. They develop a plan and carry it out. Where did the idea come from? How was it possible to realize this plan? And what consequences did it have?
Well, honestly, I don't think they thought it would be better for the river. They definitely thought it would be better for themselves. So the Chicago River, Chicago was built very deliberately along this river. It's not a very mighty river. It's kind of a puny river that runs directly through the city. If anyone's ever been to Chicago, you see this river in the middle of the city. That's the Chicago River. And it was built along this river because one of the things that the river did is it allowed the city to dump its waste into the water, and it would be then carried by the Chicago River into Lake Michigan, which is one of the Great Lakes. And this worked okay when the city was, a small city. As it grew and it poured more and more of its waste. And as I'm sure people, well, Americans would know, and I believe maybe even Europeans would know, Chicago was the great slaughterhouse for the US. It was where a lot of the, livestock came, it was slaughtered and then shipped from Chicago. And so also you got all this sort of waste from these huge slaughterhouses. And it was said that the Chicago River was so thick with filth that a chicken could walk across it without getting her feet wet. And this was at the end of the 19th century. So right at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, the sort of city fathers, and I guess they probably all were men at that point, decided this really can't go on because Chicago also draws its drinking water from Lake Michigan. So it was pouring its own sewage into its drinking water. And you got a lot of waterborne disease. You had a lot of outbreaks of waterborne disease for pretty obvious reasons. And so it was decided, well, we've got to reverse the river. We can't be pouring our sewage into the lake. We have to be pouring it away from the lake. And that entailed what was probably the largest construction project of its day. This was before the construction of the Panama Canal. A whole suite of earth-moving techniques were invented just to do this, just to reverse this river. And it entailed building this canal that then connected the Chicago River to the whole Mississippi River system. So now Chicago's sewage, which still gets poured into this waterway, although now much more highly treated through sewage treatment plants, works its way all the way through the Mississippi River system down to New Orleans, where it finally is emptied into the Gulf of Mexico.
Another example is the Mississippi River. This river flooded repeatedly, destroying towns and villages that were near it. So people regulated its course and built high dams, which stopped the flooding, at least partially, but led to an even worse disasters. How did it happen?
Well, the French came to found the city of New Orleans. It's over 300 years ago now. So in 1718, they sort of parked themselves in this very strategic location near where the Mississippi River hits the Gulf of Mexico. And that was useful for obvious reasons, but it was also geologically a very, very difficult place to settle. It's a river delta. It flooded constantly. It used to flood basically every year. The Mississippi would overtop its banks and flood New Orleans. So pretty much as soon as the French decided to put a town there, they had to start putting up these earthworks to try to control the river. And as you suggest, these became just more and more massive. The Mississippi is a very mighty river, and it, in the springtime when there's snow melt at the source, it is carrying a lot of water. And so it's very difficult, to keep it in its banks in the springtime. Now, the reason this became this control of the river, which, as you say, has been going on now for centuries, become, more and more elaborate to the current day. We continue to work on the levees along the Mississippi River, is because the whole delta, the whole Mississippi Delta, was built by the river. It was built by the river carrying all this sediment from the American Midwest that it had picked up along its route. And then when it overtopped its banks, it would spread this sediment out across the landscape. And that's the land. The land is simply the result of the river flooding. So when you think about it, you prevent the river from flooding, which is essentially what we've done. You're not building land anymore. And the land, which is a sort of soupy mixture, starts to dry out and shrink. And that's exactly what's happened. And so New Orleans, this is particularly devastating in the case of New Orleans. New Orleans is sinking. It's one of the fastest sinking places on Earth. So now you have this problem where you're trying to prevent a place from flooding while it is sinking. And now we have added on top of that sea level rise. So the situation is really pretty precarious.
Some time ago, I received the book published by the United States Department of State. It's called Endangered Species Across America 2022. It's a calendar that shows animals and plants that are in danger of extinction. When I first opened it, I thought it would be a very strange experience to take notes on a page with a picture of endangered blue whales next to it. But after reading your book, I realized that the title category, endangered, is not at all obvious or the only one. There are other terms by which we indicate animals and plants that need to be taken under protection. Please clarify, what is the difference between endangered and critically endangered or possibly extinct species, for example?
Well, those are terms that are used by what's called the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN. This is an international body, and it composes every year what's called the Red List of endangered species. It's a very incomplete list. The IUCN would tell you that, most species on Earth, we don't even know how many species there are on Earth, many millions. Most species are invertebrates, and we don't do a very good job of keeping track of them. But that being said, the IUCN has pretty clear definitions, which I will be frank and say I do not know off the top of my head, but they are basically if you've lost a certain amount of your population over the last 3 generations. So if the trend lines are very bad, then you're critically endangered. If they're bad, you're considered, endangered, and then you go down to vulnerable. And then if no one has seen you in a very long time, and there are very strict definitions, so there are many, many animals that are almost certainly extinct in the wild who have not yet been classified as extinct in the wild, because you have to sort of wait a certain amount of time. They might pop up again if you're optimistic. So then there's extinct in the wild, which means that there are still populations that are preserved either in zoos or in breeding facilities, and then there is simply extinct. We do not think there are any members of that species left in the world.
Listening to such stories about rivers, about these species endangered or extinct, people who are not indifferent to the future of the Earth and the species living on it, usually react in a very energetic way. They demand an end to all interference with nature. The Anthropocene, the name of the era in which man's impact on nature is devastating, should be ended, activists argue. But your reaction, or to be precise, the reaction of various people from your book is different. While we cannot stop controlling, we must control differently, you suggest. But what does it mean? How should we control the nature?
Well, the sort of thematic of the book is looking at these examples where either purposefully, for example, in the case of reversing the Chicago River, or trying to control the Mississippi, put the Mississippi in sort of a straitjacket, we've created impacts that we now don't like. And instead of stepping back and saying, okay, well, let's abandon this effort. In some cases, it's simply too late. The damage has been done. There is no going back. In some cases, it's just politically infeasible. For example, it's really infeasible at this point to just say, well, let's just abandon, the system of levees around New Orleans. Let's just let the city flood. A lot of the city is below sea level at this point and would flood pretty quickly. But for political and social and economic reasons, that's not considered a viable possibility. So the next step in our thinking, and I use "our" in a very loose way here, is okay. Well, is there some way that we could impose a new level of control on top of the old one that would counteract the effects of what we did previously? And that is really the pattern that the book is looking at. And I think that implicit in that, in many of these adventures, I suppose, in control and control gone awry, is this question of whether you can go back. In some cases, as I say, it's really, really hard. You can break an egg. It's really, really hard to put the egg back together again.
The late Ruth Gates, one of the persons you interviewed for the book, told you that she's a realist. Let me quote her words. "I cannot continue to hope that our planet is not going to change radically. It already is changed." And another quote from her. "Really, what I am is a futurist. Our project is acknowledging the future is coming where nature is no longer fully natural." Would you say that we should all adopt this perspective? We should move between realism and futurism, between the belief that the Earth has changed, is changing, and will continue to change, and the conviction that the nature of the future will not be entirely natural?
Well, I really try, in the book, and this reflects my genuine beliefs. I don't sort of take a stand on that issue, as it were. I go out and talk to people like Ruth, and I should say that Ruth, my encounter with Ruth, which is in the middle of the book, was really what set me on this project of writing Under a White Sky, because she was a very, very forceful and very charismatic person. Now, what she was trying to do is combat the loss of coral reefs. So coral reefs are very complicated, communities, really, and they're built by these tiny little animals, gelatinous animals that produce the substrate of the reef, that hard substance that we think of as the reef, and they don't like it when water temperatures get too warm, and so you're getting these events called coral bleaching events, and I'm sure people have heard about them. They, if they don't last for too long, the corals can recover, but increasingly you're getting them in quick succession and lasting longer and longer, and so most reefs in the world have really been devastated by a variety of factors, including now increasingly bleaching. And Ruth's point was, look, you're not getting that heat out of the oceans. And she's absolutely right. There's literally no way to do that. We've pumped massive amounts of heat into the ocean owing to, the carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere. I'm not going to, kind of go through the physics of that, but, trust me on it. There's tremendous amount of heat in the ocean that wasn't there, and it's not coming out anytime soon. So her point was, look, we're not getting the oceans of the past back, and she's absolutely right. And so her thinking was, well, let's basically breed up these corals that can withstand these higher temperatures. And it's a very, very intriguing idea. And the project continues, even though Ruth very sadly passed away quite young a couple of years ago. But it's not clear. It doesn't follow, unfortunately, it doesn't follow just because we're not getting the oceans of the past back, that the oceans of the future, that we can save these things. And I went to visit Ruth very, very skeptical about this project. And I will be frank and say I am still quite skeptical of the project. But the question of what to do in the face of, as I say, these sort of irreversible changes, or changes that are irreversible on a human life scale, or even on in terms of the foreseeable future for humans, these are the questions that we keep bumping up against. And what we're very, very good at doing is trying to come up with technological solutions to these problems. Will they work? That is sort of the question of our century.
One of your interviewers urges people to change the paradigm of thinking about the carbon footprint. He claims that carbon footprint is like a sewage. So humans will not stop producing it, and therefore we must deal with it in a different way. He also suggests that we should quit blaming ourselves for the actions that led to the climate crisis. I feel that the blame strategy is being used by some policymakers to control societies. It's not often you see politicians admitting guilt. It is individuals who do that. Would you agree that it's a part of political strategy?
Well, I don't know. That's a very, very complicated question. I certainly think in the U.S., that we still believe that we are our political system. We elected these people. They reflect our views. So I think it becomes a very complicated dialectic between, who is quote unquote to blame here. And while there's been, massive amounts of disinformation purveyed by people and organizations and politicians with a personal interest and often an economic stake in, preserving the fossil fuel dependent system that we have, I do think we have to be frank, certainly here in the US, and say, look, people voted for these people. There's really no excuse at this point for that, but yet it continues. So I don't think there's a sort of a clear answer there. Now, to go to what Klaus Lackner is talking about in this idea that we should treat CO2 the way we treat sewage. It's a waste product, and we should confront it that way, not make it into sort of an ethical issue, as he says. I believe I quote him also in the book. You wouldn't ask people to go to the bathroom less frequently. That is, certainly a very provocative thing for him to say. I would ask people to emit less CO2, but I would also acknowledge, I'm someone who's very, very aware of climate change and of how I am contributing. And yet I still do things, lots of things, drive, fly, that I know are contributing to the problem. And his point was making people feel guilty for partaking in modernity, which is what we are all doing and what those who are not doing aspire to do, is not a very useful political strategy. And he may be right.
We tend to idealize the past, seeing evil only in the actions of people living today. But the panorama you create in your book is very broad and gives us an idea of what was going on in distant times. Some say that the history of man's destructive impact on the environment is almost as long as the history of man himself and herself. So when did the Anthropocene start?
Well, the Anthropocene is this idea that we live in a new geological epoch. We technically live in the Holocene, which is a very short period in geological terms. It's the period since the last ice age, the last roughly 12,000 years. The last ice age ended. And the feeling is, among many geologists, that this has not been officially adopted, I should point out, we are in a new geological epoch in which human impacts really vie with the great forces of nature. I think that's really not debatable at this point. Now, when did it start? There have been many sort of pretty technical efforts to kind of figure that out. Where would you draw the beginning of this epoch? And I think a kind of consensus has emerged that you would draw it right around at the beginning of the post-war period, when human impacts on the planet, which had certainly been very large, really started taking off in this exponential way. And if you go online and you type in the Great Acceleration, you can find a series of graphs about, our use of fossil fuels, our fertilizer use, our miles traveled, things like that. And you see that around 1950, those lines started to ascend almost vertically. So, it's been proposed in a sort of quasi-formal way, even, that we mark the beginning of the Anthropocene as the period when we were doing the years, shortly after World War II, when we were doing above ground nuclear testing. That has left a very clear signature, that will be detectable for many millions of years. So that's one possibility.
A certain regularity repeats itself in the stories you tell in your book. Whenever man tries to control nature, many times he or she improves one thing, but spoils another. If this regularity should teach us anything, it is that experimenting with nature can bring disaster on our heads. Certainly, each new way of controlling presented by you, controlling what has been spoiled by others, is associated with hope. But can we really count on these new ideas?
Well, I very much, leave that to you, the reader, to decide. That is sort of the, theme, I suppose, of the book. These things can be seen. These interventions, to counter previous interventions, you can find them hopeful and inspiring. I think the way Ruth Gates did, or the way she portrayed them, or you can find them, terrifying. And the book sort of builds along from interventions that we might, you and I, sitting here might say, okay, well, that makes sense to try that. And okay, maybe that makes sense. And it's sort of a slippery slope towards interventions that I think many people would find, very problematic. But it's not clear, where to draw the line. And as we plunge ahead, another thing that's really important point to make, and it really gets back to Ruth's point, where we can't go back very easily. It's nice to imagine, to romanticize the possibilities, but it's simply not possible. And we are dealing with, alternatives that include, it's not like, oh, one alternative is just going back to, the way things were pre-industrial revolution, and, everything will be fine. That's not an available option, when you have 8 billion people on the planet right now, who all, for example, need to eat, and who are all, many of whom, half of us, basically depending on, for example, synthetic fertilizer. So we're not going back, without massive suffering. And also potentially we're not going forward without massive suffering. Now, these are very ugly choices. The choices are not good. They're not like we have some perfect choice, which only if everyone could get on the same page, we could move forward on. Unfortunately, the choices are all not good. They're various forms of massive change with very uncertain outcomes. That's the situation that we're in. It's not a happy situation to be in.
So let's talk about some of the ideas you described in the book. Like, for example, genetic engineering. You write about a company that sells a kit for genetic manipulation. Following the instruction on the box, you created a new organism within a week. First, you grew a colony of E. coli in one of the petri dishes. Later, you swapped out one letter of the bacteria's genome. This made the bacteria you modified resistant to a very powerful antibiotic. That experiment immediately turned on a red light for me. Are we not playing with fire or with ice here? In one of the, I'm referring to ice because in one of the passages you mention Kurt Vonnegut's concept of Ice 9, which appears in his satirical novel Cat's Cradle. A certain kind of ice, that's his fantasy, a certain kind of ice more stable than ordinary ice, when this ice 9 comes in contact with liquid water of precise temperature, it acts like a seed crystal and causes all the water to solidify. The water quickly crystallizes as more ice 9, which effects with total disaster. So, aren't we playing with fire here? Or ice?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, the context in which I talk about Cat's Cradle and Ice 9 is a technology, not just genetic engineering, but it's a sort of variation on genetic engineering called gene drive. Or synthetic gene drive, I guess I should say. And here the idea, without getting too technical, is that you can not just create a genetically modified organism, but you can program that organism so that to pass on that trait to its offspring. And you can do that even if the trait is extremely deleterious to the organism. That sort of defies the laws of evolution. How's that? So we could sort of program populations of organisms to go extinct, at least in theory. There already exist these mosquitoes that have been genetically engineered to wipe out populations. They're sitting in a hopefully very biosecure facility in Italy. And the idea is that you could release them in Africa where there are high malaria rates. You could get rid of mosquito populations, malaria carrying mosquito populations, and you could prevent a lot of malaria cases. Now, that is a very noble goal. I think that most people would get behind that goal. But the problem with releasing these organisms in the wild is you have lost control at that point. You cannot control their impact. And when you think of this organism that spreads a trait that, potentially, once again, in theory at least, you could get rid of all of the mosquitoes of a certain species in the world. Now, once again, people aren't terribly attached to mosquitoes. Maybe they don't find that, that alarming, but then we work our way up, the food chain. And I visited some people in Australia who were working on a gene drive mouse. And here the idea was, we've introduced rodents to a lot of places where they shouldn't be. They're very destructive on islands. They're a terrible cause of extinction. And what if we could program these mice populations to basically obliterate themselves? We could save a lot of other species. I think that's true. And the question is it worth the risk, of obliterating all the mice in the world? To do that, these are questions that, fortunately, I will be frank and say journalists don't have to answer. But, eventually someone is going to have to answer them. And I think another theme of the book really is that our technologies have already far outstripped, our political and even ethical frameworks for dealing with them. So we have a lot of technologies out there, including, the one that I got in the mail, this kit to, make a genetically modified antibiotic resistant E. coli that are, it's questionable whether that's legal, that are just sort of floating out there without proper oversight.
This is the third year with the COVID-19 pandemic. It seems that we got used to the presence of the threat. Restrictions have been cancelled in some countries, including Poland, even though the virus is still circulating and causing severe disease. What surprises me the most is that we, as societies, have stopped asking questions about the origin of the virus. Perhaps scientists still ask the question, but I don't come across that kind of reflection frequently in a daily conversations. And yet, it seems to me that this question is a key issue. What do you think? Is it natural, or, to paraphrase Ruth Gates' words, not quite natural?
Well, I do not want to claim to be, an expert on the origins of COVID, but I think that increasingly, the general belief, or maybe it always was, it was interesting to think that it had emerged from a lab, but I think that most scientists believe that it is a product of what's known as a spillover event. Which happen all the time. A virus that's been, restricted probably to a species of bat, even that we're not quite sure, but let's assume for a moment a species of bat. It may be jumped into an intermediate species. And then from there, quite possibly, very likely, it seems, at this big kind of chaotic marketplace in Wuhan, where there were a lot of animals from a lot of different places, it managed to, some mutation occurred that allowed it to be transmissible to humans. And now here we are. Now, the reason that, we have never solved this problem, there are two reasons / possibilities. One is that the Chinese have been extremely reluctant to let anyone, do the kind of detective work that you would need to do. And probably a lot of the evidence, to be frank, at this point has simply been destroyed. If you'd really wanted to know how it happened, you would have had to preserve everything. And the second reason is it's simply very, very difficult. There's a lot of viruses out there. There's a lot of species out there from which it could have come. So while it was really interesting and captured the public's imagination to imagine, mad scientists tinkering in a laboratory and creating it, I think the truth is probably a lot more prosaic, which actually honestly should be more frightening to us, because there's a lot of viruses out there just waiting to make that leap.
Elizabeth, is it true that one day in the future we will start breathing diamonds?
Well, I don't think diamonds will be the particle of choice has that, because there are potentially dangers with breathing diamond dust. But the idea that you're alluding to, which is where my book Under White Sky takes its title from, is this idea that we will try to counteract climate change with a new form of engineering known as solar geoengineering, in which, by which we would sprinkle some kind of reflective substance, diamond dust has been suggested, in the stratosphere, which would reflect light back to space before it hit the Earth, so there'd be less direct sunlight hitting the Earth. And this, it's theorized, would have a cooling effect, and so potentially, as I said, counteract climate change, global warming. And the reason that we have a fair amount of confidence that this could work is because it's what volcanoes do. When you get a major volcanic eruption, you get a lot of, and it has to be quite a major one, you get a lot of sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere, and this forms these little droplets, that are very reflective. It's why you get these beautiful sunsets after a major eruption, and you also get depressed global temperatures for about a year or so until this sulfur dioxide drops out of the atmosphere.
Let me quote your words. No one can say exactly how hot the world can get before out-and-out disaster, the inundation of a populous country like Bangladesh, say, or the collapse of crucial ecosystems like coral reefs becomes inevitable. I don't know which is more disturbing. Is it that the climate is warming, or that scientists don't know how much it might warm before disaster strikes? Don't sentences like these ones have a calming effect on policymakers who are delaying key anti-crisis decisions?
Well, they shouldn't. I mean, this is the problem with the way that science is often used by policymakers. But, the notion of error bars and uncertainty, it always goes both directions. And, it's quite possible that we've already warmed the earth enough to set in motion disastrous changes. So to say to yourself, oh, well, it must be on the high end is kind of, that's very foolish. That's what happens in the horror movie when people say, oh, that's not really a monster, But so if anyone's calmed by that, they shouldn't be.
It is clear that the decision to take certain steps is as much scientific as political. It seems to me that these languages, the language of science and the language of politics, are unlikely to meet because those who use them have separate goals. So how to deal with this? How to deal with this problem that policymakers go to one direction and scientists want them to go the opposite direction?
I don't have a good answer for that, obviously. I mean, it's really one of the most urgent issues of our time. And, all I can say is just recently, a lot of climate scientists in the US and I think around the world, have gone out to get themselves arrested in an effort to say, look, we have all of these tools that allow us to see, around the corner. And what we're seeing around that corner is really scary, and you should be listening to us. Now, once again, to quote unquote blame the politicians, unfortunately, that blame does, boomerang back on us, on the voters. What are we, are we all taking to the streets? Are we all insisting that our representatives face up to this problem? I mean, we have this interesting situation right, now in the States, and I'm sure across Europe, where, gas prices are going up. Well, if you want to deal with climate change, and it's good that fossil fuel prices are going up. That's actually, one way to bring down fossil fuel use. But we have such a political clamor and outcry in this country when that happens, that the Biden administration, which claims to be very concerned about climate change, releases massive amounts of gasoline to bring gas prices down. Well, that, these are, the politics around these issues are very difficult and very complicated. And I appreciate that. At the same time, I appreciate that the scientific news, the word from the scientists is pretty clear. I mean, they're getting increasingly, sort of desperate, I think, scientists to get that message out. And if we're not listening, and once again, I use we rather loosely, who's to blame here?
When I read the passage in your book about the explosion of the Tambora volcano and its effect on the cooling the climate that people experience in the second decade of the 18th century, I thought that we still don't talk enough about how climate conditions affect culture, for example, painting or literature. After all, I take it from your book, Caspar David Friedrich or Turner reacted to what was happening to the climate at that time by creating certain works of art. They pictured the world around them according to what they saw and what they experienced. Byron and Mary Shelley did the same. What we regard as a product of the pure imagination was actually determined by a volcanic eruption.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story. I mean, Mount Tambora, which is in Indonesia, what's now Indonesia, was one of the biggest volcanic explosions in recorded history, and it created in 2016, I guess, what has become known as the Year Without a Summer. And, you know, it's no coincidence, really, that Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein that summer. She was on lake in Switzerland, and the weather was quite dreadful. There really was a year without a summer. Many people went hungry as a result. And if you read Frankenstein, which I recently reread Frankenstein, the weather plays a huge part in it, dreadful weather. So that is very interesting. And as you also mentioned, you know, people have looked at paintings from that time. As I said, you get these fantastic sunsets. Some people have said Turner's sunsets were influenced by Mount Tambora. So you do get these interesting ripple effects through art.
In the book, you make frequent references to literature. You quote writers who wrote about nature. Are these quotes just illustrations? Or do you believe that literature can help us understand and solve at least some of climate problems?
Well, I think I guess neither. You know, I myself studied literature in college. I am a big lover of literature, I suppose. And I think that, you know, great writing is doesn't necessarily inspire us to anything practical, but it is inspiring on a spiritual, I suppose, or aesthetic level. And so, you know, writers often, you know, borrow other writers whom they admire, and that's really what I'm doing. I'm just trying to, I suppose, you know, I don't want to say borrow because they're all quoted, but I'm trying to express my own admiration for those writers. I think they're telling us something, you know, and sometimes I'm using their words in a very, very different context from what they intended, but I think they tell us something important and true and beautiful. You know, all of the writers whom I quoted, I admire tremendously, you know, from Kafka to Conrad. And I don't want to say that it has a practical significance, but it certainly has an aesthetic significance.
Elizabeth, thank you for sharing your thoughts. Thank you for this inspiring conversation.
Thanks for having me.
These are very important topics, and I hope that this little hope that appears in your book is not illusory. I hope that we can really solve some of the problems.
Well, I think, you know, I guess I would just leave with the concluding thought that I think that, you know, there are really bad outcomes and there are, you know, better outcomes. And the choice that we're left with now, you know, is not between a perfect outcome and a bad outcome. It's sort of between a bad outcome and a worse outcome. And we really need to try to limit the damage that we're doing. And we need to think things through a lot more carefully than we have in the past. You know, that's a lot easier said than done. But I guess if there were a message that I wanted to leave people with, it would be that. And we also have to, you know, sort of grow up and be mature enough to acknowledge that, you know, there are no simple answers here.
Let me give our audience an update on the next episode of The Nature of the Future. Next month, my guest will be Peter Pomerantsev, with whom I will talk about today's propaganda mechanisms and the future of manipulation. So please, dear audience, dear all, remember the date, the last Thursday of June. Be with us, be with Conrad Festival. Elizabeth, thank you again.
Thanks again.